welcome and good morning to everyone. My name is Tim Oakes. I'm the Faculty Director of the Center for Asian Studies, and it is my pleasure and honor to host this event and to introduce today's speakers for this very important roundtable on the current and past situation in Xinjiang province in China. What I'm going to do is just introduce the speakers very briefly so that you get a sense of the distinguished panel that you have in front of you. It's a pretty rare occasion that we have a group like this in one place, and so I'm particularly excited about that. And then I'm going to turn things over to Alessandro Rippa, who is the key organizer of this event and will serve as the moderator for the panel as well. And I'll start by introducing Alessandro, who is a postdoctoral researcher and a filmmaker here at the Center for Asian Studies. Alessandro received his PhD in anthropology from the University of Aberdeen, where he wrote a dissertation on the Karakoram Highway and China-Pakistan cross-border interactions. He's conducted extensive ethnographic research in China since 2009, and his most recent publication in critical Asian studies deals with with urban development in the city of Kashgar. Then I will introduce our panelists in the order in which they will be presenting to you. So we'll start with Ryan Thum, who is a senior research fellow at the University of Nottingham. Ryan is a historian of Islamic China, and his 2014 book, The Sacred Routes of Uyghur History, was awarded the Fairbank Prize in East Asian History, the Shu Prize for East Asian Anthropology, and a book award from the Central Eurasian Studies Society. He has recently given testimony on this issue before the U.S. Congressional Executive Commission on China. Second will be Professor James Millward, Professor of Intersocietal History at the Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. Professor Millward is a leading expert on the Qing Empire, and especially the history of late Qing imperial frontiers. Also an expert on the Silk Road and on Xinjiang specifically, and on the history of music, of Eurasian music, where he is currently working on a book on Eurasian lutes. And I mention this just because I use Professor Millward's work on this topic in my geography of China class, and so it's particularly nice to have him here with us today. His most recent book, The Silk Road, A Very Short Introduction, came out in 2013, 2014, Too long ago. He has recently published an essay in the New York Review of Books that caught a great deal of attention on this topic as well. Third will be Darren Byler. Darren recently completed his PhD in anthropology at the University of Washington, where he is currently a lecturer. Darren conducted 2 years of ethnographic fieldwork in Xinjiang, funded by Social Science Research Council, American Council of Learned Societies, the Jiang Jingguo Foundation. He has numerous publications, including digital scholarship, as well as translations from the Uyghur language. He curates the Digital Humanities Art and Politics repository called The Art of Life in Chinese Central Asia. And he has also given expert testimony on this topic for the Canadian House of Commons. And these days it seems like whenever there's a New York Times story on this issue, Darren is being liberally quoted on that, so it's great to have him here. Fourth will be Sarah Tynen. Sarah just recently successfully defended her dissertation here at CU Boulder just yesterday, and she's still standing or sitting, I suppose, as the case may be, and she still has a smile on her face too. And so it's great to have her here. She completed 24 months of ethnographic fieldwork in Xinjiang on urban space, migration, and everyday life in a Uyghur neighborhood in the capital city of Urumqi, and also incredibly challenging and difficult fieldwork. She has publications in space and culture, Eurasian geography and economics, and other journals as well. And then we'll wrap up with James Leibold, Associate Professor of Politics and Philosophy at La Trobe University in Melbourne. Professor Leibold is the author of most recently Ethnic Policy in China, as well as earlier a book called Reconfiguring Chinese Nationalism about the history of this region in particular. He's an internationally known recognized expert on ethnic policy and ethnic conflict in China, particularly among Uyghurs in Xinjiang. He has numerous books and articles, and he's currently the lead investigator on an Australian Research Council project on urbanizing Western China. And of course, his work and opinions and views often also appears in international newspaper coverage of this event. Before I turn so it's a very distinguished panel. I hope you all can see that from the introductions that I've just given. But before I turn it over to Alessandro, I just want to, I feel like as the director of the Center for Asian Studies, I need to kind of make a statement about what this is about and what this is not about. And because of the heightened kind of media attention of this kind of an issue, and frankly, the very highly political nature of what we're talking about in terms of how the US government is viewing it, how the Chinese government views it, obviously, but also how it appears in the media. Just earlier this week, the New York Times, of course, ran an editorial about the situation in Xinjiang. So I just want to clarify that the Center for Asian Studies exists not to criticize China or specifically, or not to pile on any China bashing, but we are here to further our understanding of what goes on in Asia, and in this case specifically in China. Our job is to provide a forum for researchers who have had direct and recent field experience and who know this region very well. And so we are here today to provide clarity, to provide nuance, and to understand better what is happening, why it is happening, and how it is happening. So with that, I'll turn things over to Alessandro and we'll get started. Thank you again for coming.
Thank you, Tim, for the introduction, and good morning, everyone. Welcome. I'm going to make a few very quick comments at the end before we open this up for discussion. But for now, I think we're just going to start with our first speaker, Rian Thum.
Thank you all for your interest in this issue and for coming out. And I want to thank Alessandro for organizing this. If you're here, you probably already know that several 100,000 or maybe more than 1 million members of primarily Turkic-speaking minority groups in China have been sent to a network of detention facilities with no criminal charges over the last 2 years. And what I want to do is, we have such a wonderful group of people here to talk about all the various nuances of what's going on, but I want to give us a evidentiary foundation. How is it that we know this? Depending on what media you read, you might see, you'll see, for example, the New York Times talking about this, what I just told you as a matter of fact. You might see Reuters talking about activists say that there are roughly 1 million minorities in these internment camps. But in fact, the evidence is quite solid and quite clear. And so I just want to give you all a up-close look at some of that evidence, because some of it doesn't often appear in the media stories about this topic. I will skip this, although it's no, I guess I'm not skipping it. I think it's useful to know that Uyghurs tend to live in the southern half, but I do need to skip some slides to make sure I fit in my time slot here. So the first kind of evidence that came out, the earliest evidence that we had of this mass internment system, was from eyewitnesses, from people whose relatives or friends disappeared, which I should say includes most or all of us on this panel who've had friends, colleagues disappear, but also from people who worked in the camps, and then people who were in the camps and for one reason or another were released, which is actually a very rare occurrence. And from them, we started to get a sense of what goes on. It's a sort of military style of discipline, which is backed up in the most extreme instances by torture, aimed at indoctrination program. And I'm sure you'll hear more about that later. When you want to disappear and imprison 10% of an ethnic group, you still have to decide which are the 10% who go in and what are the 90% who stay out. One of the interesting things we have from eyewitness accounts, and this includes, a lot of this evidence includes police officers on the ground in Xinjiang who get cold calls from reporters and will often answer quite frankly why it is they chose a particular person for internment. There's good evidence that the police have to fill quotas, and that some police have had great difficulty in meeting their quotas, in finding enough people who are supposedly suspicious for one reason or another. And so they've had to imprison people. These are not criminal charges. They don't say you're going for doing this. But when relatives ask, or when a reporter asks, how do you decide who goes? They say, well, we look for people who do these things. So here are some. I won't go through them. Having WhatsApp on your phone, giving up smoking, a whole bunch of rather minor things. Okay, so that was the first kind of evidence that came out. People can always call into question eyewitnesses, although it's quite difficult when you have such an enormous number like we do. But it's extremely difficult to call into question the documents produced by the Chinese government itself. And we have a lot of those. The most prominent kind of document we have is a tender construction bidding document. This is there's a system in place in China to get rid of corruption, whereby local governments, when they want to build something large or buy a bunch of equipment, they are supposed to advertise it online publicly so that companies can compete for the contract to build that. They put out these calls for contracts for the internment camps. And the first major use of this kind of evidence was by Adrian Zenz, a scholar in Germany, who used over 50 of these to create the first estimate of how many camps there were, and to go along with that, the estimates of how many people were being placed inside of them. And when these first started to appear in 2016, 2017, they were quite explicit about what was going on. We can see from them a range of the different names that the Chinese government has called these camps over time. I'll show you a chart in a minute. But I just wanted to show you what these actually look like, because you can see them referenced in the media, but they rarely reproduce them. So here you can see this is Bachu, which is Maralbishi in Uyghur, the town, or the county rather, calling for a legal system education transformation school. You can see in these what organization, what part of the government. Right there, it's United Front is calling for this construction. And then they will give some very slim details about what kinds of things your company is going to have to provide if they build this. And in those details, you get a sense of what kind of buildings these are, what kind of goals these are. And what I've chosen here is like a sort of middle of the road one. There are ones that have wild things like, cattle prods and various kinds of devices that are clearly designed to inflict violence or torture on people. But this is sort of middle of the road one, calling for security fencing, something called hardened isolation, security doors and windows. You can read the rest. I'm try to keep this brief. So this is what one of those documents look like. And you can see, one of the nice things about collating all of these is you can see the way that the names for this system have changed over time. And what's really revealing, my highlighting is not showing up for some reason. What's really revealing is that the names are modular. So they'll drop the legal system part, but they'll keep the transformation. And so you can see the overlap between the various things, which gives you the sense that these are all basically the same institution just changing its name over time. I put these in in chronological order here. Radio Free Asia, which is really the only major media outlet outside of China doing reporting with reporters who speak Uyghur. They called one of these camps once and asked as they did the interview, they asked the guy at the desk who answered the call, what is this particular camp called? And he said, hold on a minute, I have to go outside and check the sign. They keep changing the name. And he actually set the phone down and went outside and checked the name and came back. This method of looking at these documents has also been used, not to much fanfare, actually, by AFP, the news organization, which says they looked at over 1,000 of these and similar government documents, and you can get a sense of where these camps are and what kinds of here's the cattle prods, and they had something called wolf's teeth, spiked clubs, etc. Another kind of evidence we have, which has been really useful, are satellite photos, and these have been helpful for getting a sense of also of what the character of these buildings. So, for example, you can see that they're often paired with a detention center, Kanchoso, which is a kind of a screening place where they'll decide whether you go to the internment camp or whether you go to a proper prison. But what I want to point out here is that you can see in the re-education camp, or what I'm calling an internment camp, you can see that not only are there guard towers and fencing along the outside, but the individual buildings also have their own fences controlling movement within the compound, which is very common to prisons around the world. Here you can see an image which gives you a sense of how quickly this has happened. Now, when you hear that 1 million Uyghurs have been, and a smaller number of Kazakhs have been put into these camps, it's important to remember that that is on top of the population that's already in prison. There's already an over-incarceration problem going on here. This is in addition to that. And it is something that unfolded in 2 years. This is an incredible construction project, if nothing else. And so here you can see satellite image from 2017, and then a year later, boom, you have this incredibly large camp set up. The last kind of evidence I want to introduce you to is the government's own propaganda. You may be familiar with the Chinese state's line now that these are boarding schools or vocational training centers, which are supposedly voluntary. But that's the propaganda now. A year or two ago, their propaganda was much more aimed at trying to reassure the Han population that they were properly disciplining the Uyghurs. So you get things like this, which came from a government official's WeChat account, where you have a photo that shows you clearly a prison-like environment with multiple fences and a huge number of guards clad in something that looks very much like Riot Gear. And I am out of time, so I will leave it there.
So we're going to take questions at the end. I don't know if I mentioned that earlier. Our second speaker, James Millward.
Does anyone have a map handy? So we're going to hear more in a minute from the other panelists, giving more context and interpretation of what's going on, following up from Ryan's comments. I'm actually going to provide a brief interlude and say something positive about China's approach to diversity, and multiculturalism, you might even call it, traditionally and in modern times as well. And I want to begin with a little historical anecdote. So in the in 1835, the Qing Empire reached a treaty agreement with a Central Asian state known as Kokand, the Khanate of Kokand. And this was out in Kashgar, so as you can see, sort of the far bottom bottom left corner of Xinjiang there. And it was basically a treaty allowing Kashgar to have trade relations, and more than that, it allowed Kokandis to have trade relations in the region, and also to go by their own laws and to monitor other merchants in the region. And this followed a series of invasions coupled with local rebellions over issues involving trade and some of the sort of previous rulers of the region, the Hojas, the Sufi group, coming back in. And the Qing reached this treaty after having all these sort of border troubles for several times and having to send in very expensive armies to put down the troubles and so on. They finally said, forget it, let's just make kind of a trade enclave here and we'll cede certain rights to these merchants and let them take care of the situation there. And they put the sort of laws and commercial trade duties and taxation in the hands of Central Asians called Aksakals, whitebeards. Okay. So that was 1835. Now, just a few years later, those of you who study Chinese history will remember there was something called the Opium War, where British were coming up against the maritime frontiers of China and insisting on trade rights, and fought a war, which was very, very difficult, obviously, for the Qing to deal with, and they lost it. And the treaty that came out of that is known as an unequal treaty, very famous, the Treaty of Nanking. And it ceded to the British rights to certain treaty ports, and also extraterritoriality, which allowed British and other foreigners to go by their own laws in these treaty ports, right? So this is an iconic moment in modern Chinese history, and it's really kind of the first step in this century of humiliation, which is the way the PRC sort of official history now talks about it. And it is indeed the result of gunboat diplomacy, right? But what's very interesting about that is that the Treaty of Nanking is very, very similar in the actual terms that that came out of that treaty, very similar to the treaty with Kokand just a few years earlier. And in fact, some of the same Qing officials were involved in negotiating the Treaty of Nanking, who had been out in Xinjiang a few years earlier. And if we step back and think about what the British really wanted, which was complete access to China's interior for trade, they didn't get it, right? They got access to a few enclaves. And indeed, there was another war 20 years later over similar sorts of issues. So this makes us look again at how the Qing negotiated that treaty. And we can kind of see it more, again, it's still imperialist imposition, but you can see it more as a kind of glass half empty situation rather than a glass fully empty, I guess would be one way of putting it, right? But it also shows that there were certain techniques, there were certain measures that were put into those treaty arrangements, such as extraterritoriality, such as what's known as most favored nation, in other words, granting the same rights to all the foreign barbarians, not just to one group of them. And in a sense, allowing a little bit of territory to function under a different administrative and legal system than other pieces of territory, right? In order to smooth trade, in order to deal with a diplomatic problem. Now, the treaty ports were not, neither Kashgar deal with Kokand nor the treaty ports were the first time that Chinese regimes or Imperial Qing, the Imperial Qing regime or Chinese regimes had done this sort of thing. Trade enclaves along the frontiers was a fairly common technique that was used. Also, the very way in which the Qing dealt with Xinjiang, Mongolia, Tibet, Taiwan for a while itself, under different administrative systems and under different legal systems than what we call China proper, the Zhongguo Benbu, right? That too shows this kind of flexibility and fluidity in dealing with issues of sovereignty and territory like that. All right, so what we can see in Imperial China is this kind of pluralism. It's not democratic pluralism, but a kind of imperial pluralism, and a very non-Westphalian approach to issues of sovereignty, right? It's not uniform sovereignty going right up to the borders, ending like that. It's a flexible, creative way of dealing with these kinds of issues. Now, if we fast forward to the 20th century, let's think about certain measures that are actually very somewhat unique that the People's Republic of China has taken, measures and ideas and plans regarding territoriality, sovereignty, like this. One of the famous ones, or famous innovations of Deng Xiaoping was, of course, the special economic zones, right, the SEZs. Those, as others have pointed out, are in some ways similar to the Canton system that the British operated with, or even treaty ports in a way. China was behind the driver's wheel, not foreigners in this case, but they changed the rules, the tax rules for foreigners in a special zone for trade, right? But we can also think about other things. The whole idea of one country, two systems, which has been put forward for Hong Kong, held up as a potential approach to Taiwan, right, is precisely the same kind of flexible approach to allocating sovereignty. And the very sort of territorial aspect of what we call the Minzu system itself. This is the way of organizing ethnic groups from the top down in China. There are 56 ethnic groups, of course, and some of them have autonomous counties, autonomous prefectures, and even the autonomous regions of Xinjiang and Tibet and other places like that, which in theory are likewise places where somewhat different administrative systems work. There's different sorts of representation there, ideally, very often observed only in the breach, but nonetheless, as part of the very system whereby the People's Republic of China set itself up, it has a similar kind of flexible way of allocating its governmentality, allocating sovereignty. So, I think the lesson from this is that if we actually look at Chinese tradition, and particularly sort of Qing imperial tradition, but as echoed and followed up on during the People's Republic of China, what we see is not a history of Sinicization, a history of assimilation, either coerced or somehow spontaneous. Rather, what we see is a history of this kind of very creative, pluralistic approach to administration, to law, to territoriality, which I would say right now, as we can see going on in Xinjiang, the current regime in the PRC is turning its back on. This is a tradition that they could be following and learning from and drawing on those historical resources, and yet they seem to be running the other direction towards some kind of ideal of a homogenized national identity, which of course is a myth.
Thank you. Our third speaker, Darren Byler. We got the PowerPoint.
Well, thank you so much. It's a real honor to be here, and it's great to see such a turnout, people interested in these topics. What I'm going to talk about today is some of the economic and technological drivers behind what's happening in the Uyghur region, focusing on some of my recent fieldwork over the last decade, really, but looking at some of what I saw when I was there in April of last year. So the story I'm going to tell starts really in 2010, thereabouts, when 3G networks were put in place throughout the Uyghur region. This was the first time that many Uyghurs, who are primarily rural, were able to access the internet. And when I did my first year of fieldwork in 2011, I met lots of young men who were buying smartphones for the first time, really getting online. 1 year later, in 2012, an app called WeChat came online, which is a Chinese-specific social media app, which allowed Uyghurs to communicate in Uyghur using the oral speech function, and became a very vibrant space for Uyghurs to talk about politics, religion, and jobs. And so during that period, we saw lots of Uyghurs begin to move from rural areas, villages, to regional centers, and then from there onto the city, mostly looking for work, but also for religious freedom, because in the rural areas, there was a lot more restrictions on religious practice, and a lot of what people were talking about online was religious stuff. They were talking about very normal Muslim things, like what does it mean to be Muslim, what is halal, what is haram, those sort of questions. And they were connecting themselves to people that were teaching Islam in other places, people based in Turkey, in Egypt, in Uzbekistan, and also in China, but unauthorized religious teachers. And so in 2014, when I did a second year of fieldwork, this is what the Friday prayers looked like. There was too many people to fit inside the mosque. Everyone was coming to pray. People had become quite pious, especially young men who had come from the rural areas. At the same time, though, the mosque space was seen as not the source of real Islam. It was a ritual space where you could perform Islam, but the teachings that people received in the mosque were censored by the state, and so many Uyghurs would tell me that's not really where you go to hear about Islam. Instead, you listen to teachings on SD cards. You share messages using WeChat. You upload things using the Bluetooth function on your smartphone. They met often in restaurant spaces around the mosque area, kind of illegal prayer rooms, and I attended a number of those while I was doing my fieldwork. In May of 2014, this began to change. This was when the state declared what they called the People's War on Terror. This was in response to a number of violent incidents, attacks carried out by Uyghurs and directed towards civilians in places like Kunming, Beijing, and Urumqi. That was the ostensible, at least, reason for the declaration of the People's War on Terror. But it was also the beginning of what they called a de-extremification campaign, because they said that the Uyghurs are becoming extreme. There's a Talibanization of the Uyghurs, what local officials told me, and we need to stop it now before it gets out of control. And so we saw posters like this being erected around the Uyghur areas of Urumqi and in every city in the region, banning abnormal clothing, which is basically Muslim clothing. Women are no longer allowed to veil themselves, men are no longer allowed to have beards, there is no longer any Islamic symbols on people's clothing. All these things are forbidden and will result in detention. In May 2014 is when we also saw the beginning of the re-education camps. They were small in scale initially, only maybe 5,000 to 10,000 people, mostly young men in Hotan and Kashgar prefectures, but it began already at that point. So what is the People's War on Terror, and how does it fit into kind of global terror discourse? Terrorist discourse. It's really, glomming onto what the U.S. has done vis-a-vis the Muslim world since 2001, but it's fought in a different register. Here the terrorists are an entire population of people that are native to the place where the war is being fought. They're domestic, they're citizens of the country where the war is being fought. And this population is seen as problematic for a variety of reasons, but for one of the reasons is because they are seen as stopping the expansion of capitalist development. That's at least part of what's at stake. In this case, the state is using things like checkpoints, prisons, internment camps, and cameras, rather than drones and targeted killings or invasions of countries, which is what the U.S. has done. And so it's a slower kind of violence, a more insidious one in some ways, but there's less mass death. We can also, I think, see it as a form of venture capitalism. A lot of wars there's economic drivers behind wars. There's a military-industrial complex that's often in play, at least in the U.S. case. And there's something similar here. I call it a security-industrial complex. We can see it as related in some ways to other forms of capitalism. It has a racialized Islamophobic component to it. It's attached to certain bodies rather than others. It's using a war zone as a state of exception, which is kind of a disaster capitalism, something Naomi Klein would talk about. And then there's a surveillance aspect to it, where they're using technology to draw on human behavior itself, to really securitize life itself, which is producing new forms of technology, prediction products that can be sold elsewhere. So what does this terror capitalism look like? Well, it's really three main actors in play. There's the state security, but there's also higher education. Many universities across China now have a terrorism studies center. There's journals. The Academy of Sciences has supported a lot of this effort. And then there's private industry. The AI tech firms, mostly in Eastern China, have really become major drivers of this effort. And the primary focus, at least initially, was to break Uyghur autonomy, the Uyghur internet, WeChat, because it was this space that couldn't be completely controlled, at least initially. There's now 1,400 tech firms working in Xinjiang that are part of this effort. In the last 2 years, $7.2 billion have been invested. One example of the kind of technology that's been developed and is now operationalized is an AI-enabled auto-transcription and translation of Uyghur speech. So they can actually go back through Uyghurs' digital footprint and assess what people have been talking about over the last few years. That's one of the things that people we've heard of. There's evidence that those forms of evidence are being used to put people in the camps. A lot of the technology looks like this. If you actually visit Xinjiang, this is what you'll see. You'll see convenience police stations every 300 to 400 meters, sometimes closer, in Uyghur neighborhoods throughout the region. And there's checkpoints between jurisdictions. So as you move between neighborhoods, in some cases, you move between city and the prefecture. When you move between counties, there's checkpoints that are face recognition enabled. When I was there in April, I went through this checkpoint. You can't see it well because it's a bit dark. But on the left side is a green lane. It's what people refer to them as, where if you look Han, you're permitted to go through that lane. It's just the back gate of the checkpoint, which is opened by a police officer. And they just simply look at the person's face and let them through without checking their ID. Uyghurs, on the other hand, are forced to go through the other line. I went through the other line, but because I didn't have a state-issued Chinese ID, I couldn't actually use this machine, and so I had to be scanned manually at the police station. This is what a face scanning machine looks like. This was the one that I saw in my hotel. You put your ID down on it, and then it matches the image that's on your ID to your face in that screen that you see there. The technology that's being used is really backed up by a biometric database that is really unprecedented in terms of its scale and its capacity. So all Uyghurs have been asked, and others in the province have been asked to go to the police station and submit DNA, fingerprints, blood types, and also speak into a recording device to get a unique voice signature for each person. And then everyone gets their face scanned. And the face scanning there is not simply, in this collection process, it's not simply you stand in front of a camera and have your picture taken. It's something that can take up to an hour. You have to speak and you have to do all kinds of expressions into the camera, turn from to all sides. They need to kind of get a 3D image of your face and all the sort of emotions that your face might carry. And the high definition quality of those images that are being collected is really unprecedented. To have 36 million people that have submitted this kind of data is unheard of in any other context. We don't exactly know why it's 36 million, because that's almost twice the population of the province. It might be because people did it once and then they didn't submit everything as fully as they should, and so they had to go back and do it again. Or maybe Uyghurs have told me, maybe the population of Uyghurs is much higher than we think. In addition to this, they also began a process of sending mostly Han civil servants to live in Uyghur homes, sometimes for short periods of time, a week at a time, sometimes for 90 days in a village where they would adopt a family. And they also asked local police officers, in addition to those relatives, to go into people's homes and assess the population. So they're collecting qualitative data, interview-based data. In some cases, they were looking through 10 categories to determine if the person was safe or trustworthy, normal or unsafe. So you start out with 100 points, and each category that applies to you counts against you minus 10. So if you're of a certain age, you are deducted 10 points. If you're Uyghur, minus 10. If you're unemployed, minus 10. And if you have a passport, minus 10. The number 5 and 6 that's up there are really the key ones that caught many people. It was praying daily and also having religious knowledge. What they mean by religious knowledge is unauthorized religious knowledge. Like you had passed messages on WeChat, you had gone into those prayer rooms, those things I talked about earlier. After you're determined to be unsafe, you're sent to the detention center, something Ryan mentioned, where the Reeducation already begins. I talked to a former detainee about this room, and she said it looks like a nice one compared to the one she was in. It's very crowded. There's cameras in each corner. There's recording devices to prevent people from speaking Uyghur. So the technology is also in play there. From there, you move on to the camps, which are all over the province. Ryan has talked about them. The mosques are now empty. When I was there in April, no one was going to the mosque on Friday. They're still open, but no one is going into them. There's face scanning machines at the entrance to the mosque. And so the state can still say that there's religious practice is still there. You can still go to the mosque, but no one is going to the mosque because it will send you to the camp. Uyghurs talk about this as an open-air prison because they're trapped by this security state. And they see that the lasting impact will be, the thing that they fear the most is that Uyghur institutions such as their faith, language, family, and even cuisine, their food culture is now being threatened. Families are being torn apart as parents are sent to the camps and children are sent to orphanages. From the state perspective, what's being produced through this is long-term security. And they also are talking about unlimited growth potential along the One Belt, One Road, which they say has 60% of the world's Muslim population. And so there's lots of opportunities to use the technology that they're producing in this space. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Darren. Our fourth speaker, Sarah Tynen, Boulder.
Okay, thank you so much, everyone. I'm honored to be here today to talk a little bit more about the research that I did from 2014 to 2017 in the capital city, Urumqi. So when I arrived, and this is an image of a typical image in the scene, in the city from 2014 from my research, and I'll talk a little bit about the progression that happened from 2014. I left Xinjiang at the end of 2017. When I arrived in China for the first time in 2009, Han Chinese people told me Xinjiang is dangerous, full of Muslim terrorists. And due to riots that year and a handful of violent incidents in China since then, the Chinese state considers the Uyghurs to be a significant threat. Now, 3 years later, I enrolled at CU Boulder, and I'm now a geographer of the spatial relationships of politics and culture. And I wanted to understand, as a student, how and why the government secures Xinjiang as such a remote territory and creates a national Chinese landscape there. And in order to conduct this research, I lived in that capital city, Urumqi. I learned Uyghur. I lived, dined, laughed, and cried with my Uyghur neighbors. Now, what I found was quite heartbreaking. One method of control was an endless maze of government paperwork. Every 6 months, minority rural migrants had to register with the city, and QR codes showed here were placed in homes, which allowed the police to keep track of those registrations. And sometimes those offices where people went to register were located next to police stations, which means that if people needed to access social services, they were subject to police surveillance, and it made people mistrust the government. And so as a result, Uyghurs practiced what some people call everyday resistance. And the biggest places of such resistance were homes and bodies. For example, unregistered migrants would hide in back rooms or hide in the bathroom when the police came to inspect. Everybody knew there was a special knock. The police would always pound on the door loudly several times, but Uyghurs would always knock 3 times with a single knuckle, and that's how you knew it was not the police. And this was a very important part of everyday life. Also was finding ways to go around the security apparatus to live your daily life. But to address this problem, policing was very common. Beginning in 2016, as Darren mentioned, police stations were built in the Uyghur neighborhoods on every block, and it was like cockroaches. Every minute I turned my head, there was a new police station. But since I had started living there in 2014, life was increasingly defined by police surveillance and especially discrimination, especially of poor Uyghurs who were poor rural migrants were more likely to get picked up for small offenses, such as not carrying your ID. You could get arrested for that. But beginning in 2017, I witnessed policing that increased dramatically. My friends started disappearing. And at the time, we didn't know what was going on. It was confusing and scary. The rules kept changing and escalating. So first, it was newcomers had to leave the city. No, let me correct myself, I'm sorry. At first, Uyghur newcomers were not allowed to rent homes in the city. And that was facilitated by those QR codes. The police would come and inspect. No migrants were allowed to rent homes in the city, which effectively forced people to return to their hometowns because migrants cannot afford to buy a home. And then the Uyghur shops in my neighborhood were demolished over the course of about 1 week. Pretty much every shop was closed, covered with banners such as this one, and demolished within about a week. Signs such as this one would show up. You would show up one day on the door, and it was very clear. For example, there would be watermelon inside, or dishes left inside. It was very clear that the people were not notified that their shops were going to be demolished. And you'll see, as well as Darren's pictures, I noticed were dark, and there's a reason for that, because I could take pictures sometimes with my phone, but there were some pictures I had to take at night. So this one is dark, but it says in Chinese and Uyghur, demolition and eviction is bitter for a moment, but having a new residence means fortune for life. So there was this kind of propaganda everywhere during that demolition time. And so I'll tell a little story of one person who I knew on this street. When this was in that week that it was happening, 2 weeks before, her and her family had expanded their shop. Things were going well. They had hired 2 more employees. They were living in a room in the back of the shop, but otherwise, life was good. They had bought my bike from me because I didn't want it anymore, and they were kind of planning on expanding the shop more. And 2 weeks later, I was walking down this street, and I was just, oh, hello, how are you? You know, how are things going? And she just said, my husband was forced to go back to Kashgar. I don't know why, but he took our son with him. But I'm not going back to Kashgar. I can't go back there. First of all, there's no money to be made. I have to feed my children. I have to stay in the city in order to make money. A week later, I was talking to her, and she said, well, now we're not allowed to live in the shop anymore, so I have to live illegally with my parents. since my daughter is 3 years old, technically it's illegal for her to be here in the city as well, because anyone who had been in the city since 2012 was illegal, and had been born after that. A week later I came back, and then she told me, first of all, I'm deleting WeChat from my phone. I'm probably not going to use a smartphone anymore. And I have to go back to Kashgar, because now all Uyghur migrants are no longer allowed to live in the city, period. So at the time, like I said, we were a bit confused. We didn't understand it, but later it became very clear. Those required registrations from the many years before allowed the police to locate everyone when they had moved to the city, what their ethnicity was, and the ultimate purpose was to force poor Uyghurs to go back to the countryside where they would be met with forced internment to meet those 10% quotas. And during that time, a dear friend told me, we are all just waiting for the knock on our door. Now, those Uyghur neighbors, the friends that I broke bread with and shared my heart with, I don't have contact with them anymore. Their phones are monitored and censored. Many don't even use smartphones anymore. Their passports are confiscated. Nobody is safe from the state paranoia that any contact with foreigners means potential ISIS infiltration. So why are they doing this? Why all this effort? Because many people see Uyghurs as dangerous. And they are seen as dangerous because they are poor, they are Muslim, and they look different. They don't fit into the vision of a homogenous Chinese landscape, a homogenous national landscape. And what happens when a group of people don't fit into the vision of the people in power? The people in power make room for the people who do fit into their program by incarcerating those who do not. And stereotypes about these dangerous places and people matter. The story is not so different in our own country. We have similar incarceration tactics in the US for young Black and brown men deemed dangerous due to their poverty, desperation, and difference. Thank you.
Very much, Sarah. Our last speaker, James Leibold, Trobe.
Do you want a mic or?
First, I want to thank Tim and the Center for Asian Studies for inviting us here amongst the Boulders, beautiful city for the first time. And I hope to be back. I want to thank Alessandro, who picked me up at the airport, organized a great dinner last night, for moderating. And it's with a great sense of humility that I joined this panel of experts here, individuals whose research I've long devoured. And it's very fortunate to be here. Now, this roundtable is focused on perspectives from the field. Well, my field is really my computer and Google back in Melbourne, Australia. I visited Xinjiang twice between 2012 and 2015, but I've been having a bit of trouble securing a visa of late. I'm not a Uyghur speaker, and I really don't consider myself an expert on Xinjiang per se. So in my remarks, what I want to try to do is kind of put the current situation in the larger kind of political perspective, political context in China, looking at kind of regional as well as central government developments as it relates to ethnic policy. Essentially, I want to try to answer the question, how did we get here with over 1 million Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslims incarcerated in these mass internment camps without legal recourse? Along the way, I want to kind of make some points about ethnic policy as well as cultural nationalism and securitization. My contention is that this radical turn in Xinjiang policy really represents the leading edge of a far more coercive and assimilative approach to ethno-cultural diversity in political loyalty in the PRC. Essentially represents a retreat from that flexible pluralism that Jim Millward talked about. Now, what are the key drivers in this kind of radical turn in Chinese policy? Well, I want to point out very briefly just three of them. First, there's the issue of rethinking ethnic policy. So, following the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, a group of intellectuals and policy entrepreneurs inside of China argued that China needed to urgently rethink its own ethnic policies. They argued that China had indiscriminately copied the policies of the Soviet Union, and if they didn't make a radical U-turn, they essentially would share the fate of the Soviet Union. Beijing University professor Mao Rong argued that what China needed to do was to depoliticize ethnic affairs, place less emphasis on individual Minzu diversity, and rather strengthen a shared sense of kind of national belonging and cohesiveness. When Xi Jinping came to power in 2012, another group of intellectuals, Huang Gang and Hulian He, quite brazenly called for a second generation of ethnic policies, ones that would raise the temperature on the melting pot and see the party take a far more interventionist as well as activist role in promoting a shared culture, language, and identity amongst its Minzu groups. Some at the time even quite brazenly called for the abandonment of the system of regional ethnic autonomy, and some said that China should do away with Minzu categories entirely. Second driver is Xi Jinping himself in his particular form of cultural nationalism. Now, when Xi came to power, he didn't agree with this very radical agenda to completely unwind the Minzu architecture. That would be quite destabilizing. But he was quite broadly sympathetic with the call for the strengthening of national identity and the unwinding of diversity. His China dream, in my view, is a dream of a single, unified, strong Chinese nation in which diversity has very little or no role to play. Unlike his predecessors, however, Xi believed that economic development alone was not going to solve the Minzu problem. This was the approach in the past: throw money at it, money will lead to unity and prosperity. Rather, he believed that China needed to hammer this unity on a very strong anvil of spiritual, political, and cultural foundation. He warned as well about the collapse of the Soviet Union and the potential that China could share this fate, and he called for a proactive approach to literally manufacture what he called enduring peace. This involved not only bilingual education, as well as interethnic mingling, but also the reform of ethnic minority cultures. At the Central Ethnic Work Conference in 2013, Xi had the following to state about minority cultures. He said, quote, "We should not continue with what is rotten. Rather, we should discard the dross and select the essence, weed out the chaff and bring forward new roots." This shift in kind of ideology was also accompanied by some really important institutional changes that paved the way for this new approach to ethnocultural diversity. Under Xi, we've seen a kind of sidelining, marginalization of the State Ethnic Affairs Commission, as well as the State Administration for Religious Affairs. These are two stalwarts of the kind of the Minzu status quo in China. They've been pushed aside and put under the direct supervision of the United Front Work Department, where this policy is now designed and implemented. And also in the very hands of Xi himself. Xi has been called the kind of the chairman of everything, and probably his most important post is that of the chair of the National Security Commission, which is responsible for both domestic and international security. And during Xi's first 6 years in power, Xinjiang has really emerged as the party's laboratory for a more assertive nation building as well as ethnic re-engineering. And I would argue it's been driven largely by irrational fears of instability and dismemberment. Finally, my third point, the rise of Chechen War, who I call Xi Jinping's hatchet man in Xinjiang. So Xi Jinping found a willing and able partner in the current party secretary in Xinjiang, Chechen War, who had proven himself really as an ethnic policy entrepreneur as well as a law and order aficionado when he previously served in Tibet. Now, the cycle of violence that was unleashed in Xinjiang and spread throughout China between 2012 and 2015 finally allowed Xi to push aside his predecessor, Jiang Chun-chen, in 2016, and provided the new party boss, Chen, with essentially a blank check to eliminate instability at all costs and to adopt a proactive approach to remolding the culture and people of southern Xinjiang. In his inaugural speech on the 30th of August in 2016 in Urumqi, Chen spoke about placing the maintenance of stability above all else and stretching the foundation of stability in Xinjiang. Wei Wen, or stability maintenance, was now declared the singular goal of all institutions and cadres in Xinjiang. And Chen went on to implement a whole range of new policies that really transformed life in Xinjiang, as discussed by other colleagues here today. This included these convenient policing stations that Sarah talked about in every street corner, as well as a really intrusive, preemptive form of policing and surveillance that Darren talked about, the mobilizing of 1 million cadres to befriend and spy on their minority kin that Darren has written extensively about for China File, and these so-called concentrated transformation through education camps that Ryan introduced us to. These were all badged in party speak as innovations in social governance and wrapped in a kind of a web of paternalistic benefaction. The party knows what's best. The party will transform you and remold you in its own image. It's also part of a wider Feng Chao experience that Xi Jinping talks about. It's a Maoist tactic that he reinvented, where masses are mobilized to literally hunt out hidden enemies, so-called two-faced individuals in Xinjiang, as well as other deviant groups, and forcefully transform them in the name of stability. Finally, in my last minute, I just want to come back to this issue of terrorism, and religious extremism. This is the justification that the party gives for these radical policies that it's implemented in Xinjiang, and perhaps something we can explore a little bit further in the Q&A. I personally believe it's a little bit foolish of us to dismiss out of hand some of the changes that occurred inside Xinjiang society over the last couple of decades. And Darren did talk about some of these things that he experienced amongst his informants, this growing religiosity. And I think it is important to note that some individuals were radicalized, and we cannot deny the horrific acts of terror that did occur in Urumqi, Beijing, and Kunming. And we need to try to understand the impact that had on the party leaders. They were really unnerved by this. You know, when you have bombs going off in front of the Forbidden City, where you have horrific knife attacks like occurred in Kunming. And it personally embarrassed Xi Jinping. He was in Xinjiang in 2014 when there was a bombing outside the train station. So I believe that we need to not only hold China to account in terms of international standards of human rights and law, but we also need to demonstrate how China's approach to counterterrorism also departs from international norms and best practice. And here, China's copped a lot of criticism at the UN over human rights, but very little about its approach to counterterrorism. So we need to continue to demonstrate, in my opinion, how the party state's obsession with control and stability is creating a vicious cycle of social decay and insecurity while doing irreparable damage to the Uyghur culture and people. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'd really like to thank once again our speakers today, not only for being here, not only for really insightful presentations, but also for all that you have done and continue to do for this region and its people. So really thank you very much. As Tim mentioned at the beginning, I've also done some research in Xinjiang some years back. What I'd like to do now, before we open this up for questions, is to very briefly make two quick comments moving from my own experience. In my research in Xinjiang, I was mostly looking at infrastructure development at the China-Pakistan border, along what has later been renamed and rebranded as the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor and incorporated then into the Belt and Road Initiative. The Belt and Road Initiative came out today only at the end of Darren's presentation, but I think it's important to stress the relations between the BRI and the imprisonment of perhaps over 1 million people in Xinjiang. It's not me making this connection. Xi Jinping, while giving a talk at a summit in Shanghai in 2013, only a few months after launching the Belt and Road Initiative, he said that, and I quote, "Development is the foundation of security, and security is the precondition for development." We heard similar language in James Leibold's presentation from Chechen War. More recently, the chairman of the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region declared that following the establishment of the camps and the work of re-education that they are supposed to be carrying out, the party could, and I quote, "concentrate on the 3 major tasks, namely the construction of the core zone of the Silk Road economic belt, the implementation of the rural vitalization strategy, and the development of the tourist industry," end quote. Here, development, and in particular, the construction in Xinjiang of one of the core zones of the Belt and Road Initiative is explicitly connected to the incarceration of Muslim subjects. The making, in other words, of a new geography of transnational connectivity cannot, I think, be thought outside of China's project of remaking, or as James Leibold put it now, of re-engineering minority subjects in Xinjiang. So I think when we read about the Belt and Road, when we talk about the Belt and Road, this is really something that we should be keeping in mind, not see these issues are two very different and separate things. In connection to this first point, the second and last thing that I'm going to stress here today is that what we've been talking about is not just a China issue. As we know, many, particularly Uyghur and Kazakhs in the diaspora, have courageously spoken about what is happening to their relatives and friends or to themselves in Xinjiang. China has been increasingly active and aggressive in trying to persuade several countries to return these people to China, where they would most likely be put in jail. The Kazakh government, most likely under Chinese pressure, recently arrested the leader of an organization, Atajurt, which has been at the forefront of efforts to collect testimonies from people who had previously been incarcerated or that have relatives there. There have also been some evidences of Chinese attempts to infiltrate the Uyghur diaspora in Turkey and other countries. In 2013, I spent a few months doing research among the Uyghur community of Pakistan. Back then, the issue of China's influence on the community via the Chinese embassy in Islamabad was a major reason of concern for many of these Pakistani Uyghurs. The Chinese embassy had, at the time, formed an association to, according to the official propaganda rhetoric, facilitate interactions and organize activities for the Uyghur community there. The Uyghurs of Pakistan were seen and defined by Chinese authorities as an overseas community. Some were invited to attend meetings in Urumqi, others were offered money to move back to Xinjiang. And yet at the same time, in Rawalpindi, in Pakistan, where most of them were living, local community-based attempts at, for instance, teaching Uyghur language or keeping some Uyghur traditions alive in a foreign country were shut down violently by Pakistani authorities. The Pakistani government has traditionally been very friendly and loyal to China. Not long ago, a Pakistani newspaper showed members of the Uyghur community with whom I had spoken at the time, visiting the Chinese embassy, praising the Communist Party of China for its efforts to pacify and free Xinjiang from terrorism through the construction of the camp. So obviously China clearly uses its leverage in different ways in different contexts, and countries such as Kazakhstan, Pakistan, or Turkey have very different histories vis-a-vis the PRC. But what I want to say is that what is happening in Xinjiang has many ramifications and can be divisive in tragic ways, both at home and as well as abroad, and also for those who are seemingly safe in different countries than China. So I'm going to stop here. I'm glad to see that we have about 45 minutes for questions. Before we start collecting questions, I want to remind you that we are recording this roundtable here. We're gonna put it on the website of the Center for Asian Studies soon, and I think we can go ahead and maybe collect 4 or 5 questions and then a round of questions. The mic is.
Thank you very much. My name is Claude Destray. I'm a professor of international law and human rights at the Joseph Corbell School of International Studies. This seems all too eerily familiar, except for the high-tech facial recognition and the DNA and perhaps lessons learned from ethnic cleansing and leftover bodies from the Bosnians. This sounds like events of 60 years ago, and where the Han decided to go out of their way to, again, destroy the large number of people interned, disappeared, the religion and culture summarily attempted to destroy. The international community didn't really respond then. Understandably, why the other groups, Uyghurs, Inner and Outer Mongolians, also want to keep their heads down. It's an issue I've been working on for almost 50 years of my life. The Tibetans at least have the Dalai Lama as a superstar in terms of a voice. The Uyghurs don't seem to have that. This is I'm impressed by the panel, and I'm glad to have my colleagues here, and yet this is a repeat. And so, you know, are we going to wait another 50 or 60 years? This notion that was expressed of, I was actually surprised, of flexible pluralism, as though this is a unique outer event that is not in keeping with what the Han normally do. I would suggest that this is actually a fairly regular practice done in large scale and in small scale. So this is like the 4th or 5th event that I've gone to dealing with this situation, and I'm pleased to see it, and yet I've yet to hear anyone make a connection between the events going on now and the events that happened 60 years ago.
Well, thanks to all of you. I've read most of your work. My name is Tim Weston. I teach in the Modern Chinese History here at CU. And as I was saying, I've read most of your work, so it's nice to see you in person. I have many things that I'd like to ask about, but I think the one that maybe is the most interesting to me is, of course, we always hear this notion of cultural genocide in Xinjiang, and I'm wondering if that's a term that you think is appropriate here, but also then, what concept have you been able to find that would describe what vision the Chinese Communist Party does have for a Uyghur culture? I'm hearing a lot of what it shouldn't be, but you're not going to get rid of these people, and you're not going to get rid of their history. So what's the end point here, other than obedience, and other than sort of fitting into this kind of, I guess you would say, homogenous national vision that the party seems to have?
Thank you for everybody's really informative session. Each of you, it was really interesting, just kind of...
Hey, why aren't we getting answers to these questions right away?
We're collecting a few, and then we will allow the panel to address all the questions together.
So just yesterday, I actually had to teach my undergrads about an article about Ann Stoler looking at the mechanics of settler colonial governance in Dutch Indochina, and I had to talk about how, you know, get the students to try and understand how Europe, the Dutch state, was at the same time refashioning its governance back at the metropole as well as in the colonies, and how both were reverberating in terms of how to even begin thinking about restructuring a modern government. So everything that you guys were just talking about kept coming back to me in terms of, if we're going to talk about history here, how much did 2008 securitization protocols in Tibet affect Xinjiang? And we just heard that Chen was a party leader in Tibet, and now he's being recruited in Xinjiang to kind of launch a kind of similar tactic in terms of securitization. So how much is this about empire nationalism and settler colonialism? Specifically, how much is this about the state trying to restructure Urumqi in the model that they want to see? So I'm more interested in trying to figure out how can we talk about these mechanisms. I thought actually Darren's presentation in terms of terror camps having relations with current policy in Beijing, new moves towards securitization, face recognition. How much is this about testing these security methods in the colonies? So I'd like to know more of your thought in terms of how can we connect these different mechanisms that Beijing is taking shape either in Tibet or Urumqi. I know that recently they've been building similar kinds of camps in Tibet. How much is this about taking the design from Urumqi and replacing it inside Tibet? So kind of moving the conversation beyond to talk about mechanics of empire, regardless of the fact that China wants to talk about modernity, but with Chinese characteristic, what does that look like? How much is it actually drawn from previous colonial and imperial models? Thank you.
I'll go, okay. I think I'll address this gentleman's question first, but I wanted to ask, by 60 years ago, the events of 60 years ago, you're referring to the invasion of Tibet?
Yes.
Okay. All right, first of all, I may have sounded overly Pollyanna-ish in talking about centralized pluralism. Obviously, there have been repeated assaults on all sorts of liberties, in particular on ethnic difference and so on. My reason for sort of framing things that way, or sort of bringing that fact up, though, is that really you can go all the way back to the earliest Chinese thinking, and I'm not an intellectual historian or a philosopher or anything, but even a shallow reading of Confucian and other schools of thought in early China shows that there's a tension in how to deal with cultural difference, and the sort of evolving notion of Chineseness, which is often projected back on the past, but the first projector was Sima Qian, arguably writing his records of history. So it's been an ongoing project for a long time, and there's always a tension between can difference be accommodated and brought in and turned into us through proper sort of rituals and so on, or is it what's the famous phrase? 非我族类，其心必异, right? If someone who's not my clan type of my clan, their mind, their heart must be different, right? So there's exclusivist chain there. And you can see this in arguments through the late 19th and through the 20th century, whether they're Kuomintang or CCP, struggling to do the Benedict Anderson trick of stretching the skin of the nation around that big Qing empire, right? The tension is always there. And so what I'm trying to do very explicitly in events like this is actually put out a different vision, or to re-emphasize that other more inclusivist stream that is in Chinese tradition. And when I do this, I'm also trying to address Chinese interlocutors, and particularly those within the CCP system, whom I'm assuming I can address them on the camera right now. I joke about it, but or intellectuals or others, because these arguments are actually very, very current in whether sort of new Confucianists or the New Left in China, or even sort of liberals in China, but they're stifled, and because of the increased authoritarianism of the Xi regime, I think it's increasingly impossible to even talk about them. So one thing I can do, given my limited knowledge about Chinese tradition and so on, and particularly about the Qing Empire, which I do know pretty well, is say, hey, wait a minute, there are these other examples, and Chinese states have followed them and have been successful sort of with them when they have followed them. And of course, the invasion of Tibet is an example of not following them, and but whereas the 14-point agreement, I mean, I could get in trouble for saying this too, but it's more on the other side of trying to follow at least an accommodationist approach. It wasn't observed. In any case, that's my sort of purpose in framing things that way.
I'll address a couple of the other questions, just parts of them. So what does the Chinese state want? What do they want Uyghurs to become? Well, I think one of the things we can see happening in the last 6 months is that they've begun to move people in the most minimum security parts of the camps into factory spaces that are associated with the camps. This is people that have graduated, they've learned enough Chinese, they've passed the political ideology exams. Many of them already have college educations, I think, or are fairly well educated, so the Chinese was easier for them to learn. So they moved into these factory spaces where they're basically given allowances. They're paid a little bit for their work, but they're still very closely monitored. They're sort of forced internships. The state is giving compensation to the factory owners, around 5,000 yuan per worker, at least in Kashgar Prefecture. And it's the program should last for 3 years, according to the documents I've seen. The factory owners are tasked with making sure that the workers speak Chinese and that they learn basic quality, suzhi, that they learn how to be disciplined workers. And that, I think, fits a lot with the broader discourse of this project as being poverty alleviation. That's how these relatives that are going into the Uyghur homes talk about what they're doing, is they're bringing some sort of poverty alleviation. So I think they're thinking about this in terms of economic productivity, but also the erasure of Uyghur culture. And maybe somebody else can talk about Uyghur, if it's cultural genocide or not. The second question from Dawa is interesting. How is this transferring across space? Well, we've already seen that CloudWalk, which is one of the big tech firms that have developed the face recognition stuff in Xinjiang, been there for since 2013, has recently signed an agreement with Zimbabwe to build a national level face recognition system with the same checkpoints that they pioneered in Xinjiang. So we can see it moving already across the Belt and Road. These tech firms are mostly based in eastern China, the big ones at least, SenseTime, Face++, Hikvision, Dahua, there's a whole panoply of them. And they're doing similar things in other places. They're doing face recognition in eastern China. I was talking to Tim yesterday about Guizhou. They're also doing it there. I'm not sure which companies, but it's growing across the space. And so I think what we're seeing in Xinjiang is going to find applications elsewhere. It's something that we need to watch. And I'd love to talk more about what the camps look like in Tibet.
I'll just add one element in answer to Tim's question about what the vision is, and elaborate a little bit on this idea of the erasure of Uyghur culture. I think one of the effects of the camps is to facilitate the assimilation of Uyghur children into Han Chinese culture. So there's an increasing use of boarding schools. In Kashgar, there was a recent report of 18 new orphanages built. These are presumably to house the children of people who have been sent to the internment camps. And children are being raised essentially as Han children. They're taught in Chinese. They have to celebrate Chinese holidays, things like this. So I think one element of this is that the Chinese state feels like Uyghurs are inherently a threat, but they will be less so if they are culturally Chinese. And the camps not only facilitate this by removing children from the presence of their parents, but also by serving as a disciplinary threat to parents who are not in the camps. We know that children are encouraged to inform upon their parents, to turn in forms detailing the books that their parents keep, things like this. So what this does is it makes it very difficult for parents to undo the indoctrination and assimilationist educational programs that happen in the schools. It's very hard for Uyghurs today to evade these state programs because the surveillance is so tight, and because it's no longer necessary to have a legal charge to disappear someone. It happens in a very arbitrary way. It can happen very, very quickly.
I'm not sure if I'm going to answer anybody's question, but I was going to pick up on a point that Jim made, because I think it's a really important one, about engaging with our Chinese interlocutors on this issue. I mean, I made the point in my talk, and I do believe that we need to try to hold China to international norms in terms of human rights and counterterrorism, etc. But I'm not really that optimistic on our ability to do that. I think China's kind of winning the propaganda battle on this front, largely through its economic power. But I do think there is a tradition in China that we can appeal to Chinese academics and even policymakers, a tradition that in the PRC at least made space for these 55 ethnic groups to have a form of autonomy, to have their own language, to practice their religion, to have a degree of cultural autonomy. And there were times in China when that did exist, and it was quite robust. The 1950s, again in the 1980s. These are moments that should be celebrated. There's a law that was passed in 84. The law on regional ethnic autonomy is quite progressive by international standards, but it hasn't been torn up. It's still there. It just is overlooked. In terms of where I think the future, if we sit and remain on this current trajectory, where the future of ethnic diversity goes, I think you can visit it today. It's out past the 5th Ring Road in Beijing, near the Olympic Stadium, the so-called Zhonghua Minzu Gongyuan, or the Chinese ethnic, or I think it was called racist park at one stage, where you can pay your admission and go in and wander around and look at the animals in the zoo. Essentially, it does feel much like you're visiting a zoo, with performers dressed up and performing various ethnic traditions. And the fact that many of them are Han Chinese actors doesn't really seem to matter. But I do think that's kind of, diversity is not going to disappear completely, maybe in the long run, but in the short run it's going to be turned more into a museum or a zoo.
Thank you so much for your questions. So I wanted to address your question about settler colonialism, and I kind of saw your question as a two-part question, so I guess I'll just address what I can. Thank you for bringing up Anne Stoller. I do think that her work is very relevant, and I do use some of her work to understand Xinjiang, because I do see important intersections between, for example, her work on carnal knowledge in terms of how sexuality and race is used as a tool to understand and try to define some of these biological differences between people. And so in my work, I see that happening when it comes down to conversations about interethnic marriage and what that means for people to have kids that would not be, would be only half Uyghur or only half Han. And I do think that that's a relevant issue that's happening right now, partially because the government is subsidizing such interethnic marriages in Xinjiang as well. But I do think that the female body in Xinjiang has been used in different ways to try to protect and create a border or a territory of Uyghur community. And so there is a feeling of needing to keep that purity alive, at least as much as they can. And so then your other question was kind of more about the relationship between the metropole and the colony. I do think that there are some important similarities between the core-periphery relationship in Xinjiang, and I do think that Xinjiang maintains some of those relationships. And Darren Byler has written a little bit about that. Eric Schlussel has talked about that, and Carol McGranahan in the Tibetan context has talked about the relevance of that. And so I do think that that kind of, I do think that that is relevant in the Xinjiang case in terms of the economic relationship, but as well as what Millward and Leibold have been talking about in terms of this tension between well, what does it mean to be China and what is pluralism?
Is there any more questions?
Hello, everyone. Thanks for the talk. I'm Andrew Grant. I'm visiting scholar here at the Center for Asian Studies. My question, I was just curious hearing all this, talking about Islamophobia, talking about the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, is what the role of the Hui is in any of this. Sort of there's this image, I think, within China of the Hui as sort of the good Muslim, maybe the culturally assimilated Muslim. Do they ever bring in Hui or model Hui or any of the visiting citizens Hui? Or maybe I'm totally wrong, are they bringing some of these practices to Hui communities as well?
First, thank you all very much. This is a really excellent panel. So one of the core questions that I see in discussions about what's going on now in Xinjiang is why now? I mean, there's been some answers given by the panel. Technological tools are now there that something like of this scale could take place. The personages of Chen Chongguo and Xi Jinping are clearly factors here. The international arena, which you just touched on, is such that China knows that basically no one could stop them. But there's another element that I'd be curious to hear you speak about, is whether or not the scale of interethnic violence in Xinjiang has actually increased a lot in recent years. And I know it's a sensitive question because it's used by a lot of pro-CCP commentators to justify what they're doing. But do we have any sense of the scale of interethnic violence in recent years, or is that data just too obscured?
In the larger picture, this issue is not unique to China. Using the newest technology to create a slave class who will work for free and probably be worked to death. Assimilation of Uyghur children sounds a lot like the way that Indian children were stolen from their parents and put in boarding schools or farmed out to white families to improve them. And we've seen the great things that that's done to the Indian culture. What's to prevent this from happening to any other random race or class? A class like, for instance, the Russians at one time went after intellectuals. Everyone in this room is an intellectual. We've seen these issues before. We've seen, for instance, oppressed people being forced to host their overlords in their homes. We have something in our Bill of Rights forbidding that because King George's military barged their way into American settlers' homes and demanded to be fed and housed in the best rooms, and the owners of the homes were forced to live in the barn. It happened by the Nazis in Holland during World War II. A good friend of mine had his home invaded during World War II by Nazi soldiers who raped his sisters. Another issue, stealing the oppressed race's homes and giving them to good Germans or loyal Englishmen. That's happened before. Genocide has happened in Turkey in the early 1900s with the genocide of the Armenians, who were white people, by the way, with red hair and blue eyes. The Nazis, of course, did the genocide of the Gypsies and the Jews. U.S. extermination of the Indian tribes to further westward expansion, which was the official government policy for progress and making money.
I think we have a lot of
What
people who want
is
to ask questions.
what is to prevent
Allow
this
that.
from being used against us? What are any of the people here doing to prevent the government from using these techniques against us? Against any single one of us? Thank you.
Am I waiting? Thank you. This was a very informative, very provocative panel. I think you really synergized incredible organization to put some new ways of thinking across. And especially because the Western press can be so uniform and so broad strokes in characterizing this phenomenon. And I wanted to speak, I'm Louisa Shine, I'm an anthropologist who works on minority issues in Guizhou, a very different province where Tim also works. Maybe not so different, you know the comparisons better than I do. I wanted to highlight, I don't think it's unproductive to talk about comparisons and continuities, but I wanted to highlight some of the things I heard that really helped to answer the who asked the why now question, somebody, for me, just to come back to them, because I think they speak to the questions that have been raised. So I have the idea of this as sort of a testing laboratory for whatever, especially security technology, but maybe other things that will be expanded. I heard the Belt and Road Initiative, which is extremely topical and present and doesn't speak to things like, the Tibet history, and also the larger question of capitalist development, which then comes back to the notion of factory labor, and also extends to the notion of the rural-urban dynamic being very important in Xinjiang, and something that is not necessarily so helpful for thinking about earlier interethnic moments in China. And then there is the context of the global war on terror and global Islamophobia, which also distinguishes a place like Tibet very, very starkly, in terms of how it's regarded around the world. And so in terms of this question of how it's regarded again around the world, unfortunately, we lost Tim, who wanted to raise the question of cultural genocide. I wanted to return to that question because I do find it's a very frustrating reflex in a lot of the Western coverage. And it's not, to me, a question of is it or is it not. I think a lot of you spoke to the questions of cultural suppression or cultural extinction or assimilation or whatever. But to me, the question is, how much is the culture stuff driving it? Or how much, or by contrast, how much is culture the medium by which other aims are being pursued? And I really appreciate Jim Millward's stuff on the flexible pluralism, because that's what those of us who have been living in China working on minority issues for the last few decades, I mean, I'm living it, but going back and forth, have seen is that, and so when it comes to culture, what Tim and I have been looking at in Guizhou is this tremendous fluorescence and development of culture around precisely poverty alleviation and the development of tourism and consumption. So when you have to look at that in a minority province against the Xinjiang, it makes this question of cultural genocide much more complicated, because to me, I can't locate it as the driver of these kinds of policies, and I would very much like to hear, to come back to this question of how do we talk, and how do we talk to the people, to our interlocutors here who are not China experts, who read the press and just assume that's what it's about, is extinction, assimilation, whatever. So yeah, are we taking another?
Well, My name is Frank Xiao. I'm an economist. I'm a retired faculty member of economics department. 25 years ago, I was in Xinjiang, and well, actually invited by the government. But when we visited the village of the Xinjiang, and then once I was in the street, walking on the street, and asked two Xinjiang about high school students, and asked them, "Do you like Chinese?" They were surprised. They said, "Well, we are Chinese. What are you talking about?" So I was very impressed that their high school, this cultural deculturalization, Chinization education was very thoroughly. And when I came back, I was a graduate advisor, and one of the students, MA student, I think, I remember, he said, he came to my office. He thought I'm a Chinese. So I said, no, I'm not a Chinese. Then he said, my native land was occupied by Chinese. So, and he said that he was going to, he was in MA students, and he was going to England, and from England go to Saudi Arabia or Egypt to fight against Chinese. So there are two things. My point is that why it's a good PhD thesis. Why Chinese Chinese education looks like successful, but why it failed? Those girls is about 15, 16 years old. So now after 25 years, they are 40 years, about 35, 40 years now. So apparently the education system failed to Xinize those Uyghur people. I think we have to look at the international situation and what is the tools or methods the Chinese tried to Xinize and they failed. And this can also apply to any other countries. Also in Taiwan. Taiwan also has an independent movement. Why I think they present very good effect of education on the young people and the behavior of the young people when they grow up. Why there is a difference between their activity or their thinking. Thank you.
Hello.
It's very, very quick because we only have 15 minutes.
This is Mr. Xiao, Professor Emeritus from CU Denver. I'm economist and econometrician. So basically, I'm number crunchers. I like to know that in economic policy and in political science, that there are two ways. One is carrots, one is sticks. So we are talking is all sticks. What kinds of economic policy that they try to develop over there to make the people happier and for them to more incline to the Chinese government, right? Basically, Xi Jinping want is to unite the country together. Another thing is there is a one belt, one road policy, and Xinjiang is an important place. What kinds of policies they impose to please the people there instead of just use the sticks? Thank you.
Okay, I think everybody here could answer each one of these questions, maybe in similar ways. Should I do the Hui one, or do we have more Hui? Okay, so the quick question, the answer on the Hui, to what extent, this is, you're absolutely right in that the Hui, for those of you who may not know, are sometimes Muslim Chinese or Sino-Chinese who are, they are Muslims, but they speak Chinese, and generally they're in other ways culturally similar to the other Han in wherever they live. And the Hui are all over China, so you have southern and you have northern and northwestern and so on. So it's a very mixed group really, but the common element is the Islamic faith. The short answer is it does seem to the broader movement to Sinicize religion, which Xi Jinping announced, I think, 2015 or so, 2015, 2016, has been having effects on Hui as well as it has on Christians and other places with particular focus on architecture. And the dome has been deemed to be a sign of Arabization. When I've seen some of these pictures, they actually look more like Mughal Central Asian kind of mosques than they do like Arab mosques. But in any case, there's been that. There have been made the news closures of new mosques in Yunnan and an attempted destruction by the state of a big mosque in Ningxia, I believe it was. And then most recently, and somewhat and probably most alarmingly, was an announcement that Ningxia government has signed a contract to study Xinjiang's methods of dealing with potential terrorist problems. So it does seem to be sort of creeping out. And I'd say this is kind of the expansion of this Han cultural nationalism, which James Leibold mentioned as sort of an increasingly important core idea of Xi's administration.
All right, just some quick responses to some of these questions. Continuing on what Jim's talking about, I think one of the things that makes Uyghurs unique is that they're seen as harboring or being infected by three forces or three elements: separatism, extremism, and terrorism. Separatism is the basic problem that's like kind of in the nature of Uyghurs that needs to be eradicated. Extremism, which is religious extremism is the ideology, and then terrorism is the expression of that ideology. That's how the state frames what's going on. And Hui don't have that separatist element to them because they don't have a claim to land. They didn't have a republic in the 1940s like the Uyghurs did. So I think that distinguishes Uyghurs and also Tibetans from other ethnic minorities where they have a claim to land. There's also a linguistic component to it too, where Uyghurs and Tibetans both speak their languages as their first languages, and so their epistemology, their kind of essence as people, their nativeness is really tied to their language use. And other ethnic minorities have kind of lost some of that, their indigenous languages, and so I think they're seen as softer, I think is the term that's often used, and Tibetans and Uyghurs and Mongols sometimes too are seen as hard minorities that are more problematic. Why are they doing it now? I think one of the things that's there is that they're kind of learning as they go, I think. That's a big aspect of it. But there's political will that maybe wasn't there before. The authoritarianism is really on the rise in China. And I think also the technology, sorry to harp on it, but I think they had some breakthroughs with that technology, and they were realizing, oh, this could actually work to get kind of total knowledge of a group of people, which is counterinsurgency theory 101. That's what you want to do, is get total knowledge of the population so you can detect any sort of deviance in behavior. And if you have that sort of view of a group on the level of the population, you can do all kinds of things. And Google and Facebook are also doing this. There's a new book by Shoshana Zuboff called Surveillance Capitalism, which is all about targeted advertising and prediction models and all of that stuff that the tech companies are doing. And China's leading the field when it comes to computer vision AI, perception AI. I gave a talk at Google a few months ago, and they were like, yeah, China's way ahead of us because we don't have the access to the data. So I think that's an important aspect of what's going on. One last thing, it has culture driving it. Louise's question, when I was in Kashgar in April of last year, I was asking some of these Han relatives, why is this happening? Why are you doing this? And they said, like, Uyghurs are backward. That was the term they used. that they're lacking in culture. They're not like intrinsically bad people. They just simply don't know. They've been misled by these wild imams. And so this is a benefit for them to go to these schools and learn about like their misunderstandings of what it meant to be civilized or cultured. And so they saw it as an overall benefit for those Uyghurs. They said, you know, they know it's going to be difficult because these families are being torn apart, but in the end, Uyghurs will benefit from this, and we as well, because now we can enter any space in the Uyghur region and feel safe.
I'm going to take a shot at what I think is the hardest question, which is Professor Schein's, and try to wrap in the violence part as well. And I might answer this, I'd probably answer this differently on a different day, but if I had to wrap up, you raise an interesting question. There's cultural difference all over China. There are highly varying levels of restrictions, with Xinjiang probably being the most severe, and then Tibet not too far behind. So why the Uyghurs? If I had to wrap it up, I would sum it up and simplify it. I would say that this is about loyalty to the party and about resistance to the party. On a high level of loyalty and a low level of resistance, and they're actually different things, not just two ends of the same spectrum. So, on this, in this characteristic, the Uyghurs, I think, are seen as the least loyal and the most resistant. And one of the reasons for that is the level of violence that has increased, or we can say at least that did increase through 2014, 2015. Most of that violence, at the height of the violence, 2014, 2015, when we saw maybe somewhere around 250 deaths inside Xinjiang, most of that was Uyghurs attacking the security officials who man checkpoints or local party offices, things like that. Actually, attacking the representatives of the state. So, and this is unique in China. So, I also want to say that this follows a long pattern of increasing restrictions paralleled by increasing violence. So you can make your own conclusions about which one is causing which. But from the early 90s, you have a pattern of just every year being worse than the previous one. So I think the party looks at this and says, why? And here's where the cultural stuff comes in. On the one hand, there's the kind of racism that Darren was just describing, which says, maybe if they were more Chinese, they wouldn't be so resistant, and they would have more loyalty. And that, I think, can get you all the way to a Tibet level of repression. But then you throw in Islamophobia on top, which says that these people's cultural traditions carry with it an implicit, an inherent risk of violence, and that explains the resistance that we've seen. So I think the cultural stuff, it's in interaction with the facts on the ground, and then that further interacts with changes in ideology in the CCP, particularly under Xi Jinping, which allows a cultural justification, allows an Islamophobic justification because of the alliance with the US global war on terror after September 11, 2001. But it also plays into Xi's new attempts of justifying why the CCP should be the sole organization to run China and to save the Chinese nation. And as the CCP policies have moved farther, Communist Party of China policies have moved farther away from recognizably communist policies, there's been a need to justify why the Communist Party should be in charge in ways that are different from things we might recognize as socialism or communism in an international way. And they've turned to this new ethno-nationalism, which makes it easy to justify, not only to justify what's happening in Xinjiang, but to use it as it's something to brag about. It's something which lends legitimacy to the rule of Xi and the Communist Party.
Maybe I can build on what Ryan was saying a little bit and try to answer your question about carrots. I think if you look at the kind of the background of the party's approach to managing ethnic issues and frontier governance. It's always, the starting point has always been one of pragmatism. How do we deal with these, sometimes unruly ethnic minorities that live in the periphery? It's always been local. I mean, policy is very dramatically depending on where you're at. And I think the contrast between Tibet and Xinjiang and then Guizhou and Yunnan is a really important one. You can feel like you're in different countries. And I think officials have a lot of leeway to be able to manage their local counties and deal with that problem. And they're incentivized to deal with that, to maintain stability. But that incentivizing that could be through providing carrots for those who are compliant. And we know that China in the past is, and still today, uses a range of affirmative action policies that reward ethnic minorities for certain things, including political opportunities as well as educational opportunities. And these are an important part of the mechanism that it has used. But at the same time, it has also used sticks. It's always used sticks. And I think what's happened in Xinjiang is a really exceptional moment that brings in, I think, all these things. It's really kind of hard to kind of document them because there's many different parts that occurred in the last 5 years, and many things that are quite exceptional about Xinjiang that Ryan talked about, that then saw the party not give up on the carrots completely, but certainly decide that the stick had to be used more assertively in the case of Xinjiang. So I'll leave it at that. I'll see if Sarah can add anything.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to try to address the third question, which was about how this is not a unique situation and what can be done, or what are we doing with our own government regarding these questions. I mean, absolutely this is not unique, and I addressed that in my talk today about our own incarceration system, not even to mention migrant detention facilities. So that's why we're here today. If it was unique, of course, Professor Shine pointed out some of the unique characteristics of it, of course. But that is why we're here today, is to recognize that we are repeating history, to bring light to the situation. And for example, Jim Millward wrote an excellent op-ed about how this is very serious for people living in Hong Kong. They should be paying attention. People in Taiwan should be paying attention, because this is even closer to home for them, and could be expanded to them as well. So absolutely, 100%, we are seeing some very striking patterns, and that's why we're talking about it. Now, I think one of your questions was, what are we doing to address this in our own government? And I think that everybody can choose their own path. For example, Darren talks a lot about capitalism. So you might choose to address the ways that you buy Chinese goods, or the ways that you shop locally, doing your own form of kind of moving against some of the capitalist trends. In my own personal life, I know that I try to engage in my own personal life to create community and to establish human-to-human connections. For me, that means I have very strict limits on how much I use my smartphone, because they are using our data. So I personally only use my smartphone a certain limit every day. So everybody gets to choose their own path.
I'm not trying to get the last word here. I wanted to fill in something I meant to mention before, because it's quite interesting. This sort of why now question that Brian asked. I heard in a conversation with a Chinese intellectual who's very sort of pro-state. He's pro-CCP. and then I've seen this echoed in a couple other places since, an explanation which it had the ring of being something that's been sort of bandied about and written in kind of Chinese context as well. And it was, well, now that China is moving onto the international stage, the Chinese identity needs to be more monolithic so that it can be recognized, and so that we don't confuse people around the world by having too many different faces or too many different national garb. I don't know, clothing. And I just thought that was a very curious answer, but also indicative of almost a complete reversal of this practice that we've all seen and frankly have laughed at as kitschy. I'm not laughing at it anymore. Of just the parade of nationalities, which was really very much how China chose to present itself. Most recently at the 2008 Olympics, for example, right? And so I think it does kind of say that one of the drivers behind this, one of the things in here, is this question of identity as a nation in the world and what it's supposed to look like. And a lot of insecurity about that, frankly, I think. Anyway, well, that's...
Thanks. Our time's up. Maybe we can continue this informally. Thank you all very much for coming. Let's maybe close this up with an applause for our speakers.